She was engaged to the wrong man, and she knew it. But on the night she finally had the courage to see her best friend, the person who truly loved her, everything changed in a single moment. 14 gunshots, 8 dead, and a decision that would change her life forever. But here's what nobody expected: the tragedy that almost destroyed her actually saved her. If you've ever felt trapped in a relationship, if you've ever wondered whether you were living someone else's life instead of your own, or if you've ever needed a reminder that life is too short for fake love, you need to watch this story. Because what happens next will break your heart in the best possible way. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Have you ever had to choose between staying safe and being true to yourself? I'm reading every comment. The afternoon sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse apartment, and Sarah Mitchell stood absolutely still, watching the light move across the hardwood floor. From 847 feet above the ground, the entire city seemed frozen in time. Tiny cars that looked like toys, people that looked like ants, a whole world that seemed so small and insignificant when viewed from this height. She'd always thought the view would make her feel powerful. Instead, it made her feel trapped. The ring on her left hand felt heavier today. She twisted it around her finger, watching it catch the light, and felt something cold and familiar settle in her chest. It was the feeling she got more and more these days, a suffocating sense that she was disappearing, that with every passing day, a little bit more of who she was became less important than who Chris wanted her to be. Behind her, she could hear Chris in the kitchen, preparing dinner with the same meticulous precision he brought to every aspect of his life. Classical music, choppin', always choppin', because that's what he listened to, floated through the penthouse. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as it should be according to some invisible rule book that only Chris seemed to understand. But Sarah was drowning. She could feel it now, in a way she couldn't quite feel it before, in a way that made her chest tight and her breathing shallow. She was drowning in slow motion, in a life that looked beautiful from the outside but felt suffocating from within. The diamond on her ring caught the light again, and she felt a spike of panic so sharp it almost made her gasp. 3.2 carats, $40,000. The price tag Chris had immediately shared when he proposed, as if the monetary value of the stone somehow translated to the value of their relationship, as if love could be quantified in dollars and carats. She could still remember the proposal, a restaurant so expensive that the portions were tiny, and the food was beautiful in an abstract way that didn't quite satisfy. Chris had gotten down on one knee in front of everyone, the diners, the waiters, the whole world watching, and she'd felt nothing but pure, cold dread. Not excitement, not the joy that women were supposed to feel in that moment, just dread, dark and heavy, settling in her stomach like a stone. "Yes," she'd said, "because that's what you said at that moment. You said yes, and you smiled, and you let him slip the ring on your finger, and you accepted that your life as you knew it was now over." She'd rationalized it all since then. He's just protective. He cares about you. He wants you to be the best version of yourself. These were the things she told herself when he commented on her clothes, when he checked her phone, when he slowly but methodically cut her off from her friends and her life and everything that made her feel like herself. But the truth that she'd been avoiding for years, was that she was disappearing. And the worst part, nobody could see it. Nobody could understand why she wasn't happy. She lived in a penthouse. She wore a 3-carat diamond. She had a handsome, successful fiancé. On paper, her life was perfect. But Sarah knew the truth. She knew that perfection could be a prison. She knew that beauty could be a cage. She knew that she was dying, slowly but surely, from the inside out. To understand how Sarah had gotten here, you had to understand where she came from. She'd grown up in a small town in Ohio, in a house that was always warm, always filled with genuine laughter, always filled with love that felt real and unconditional. Her father, Robert Mitchell, was a high school history teacher who wore cardigans with elbow patches and had a genuine passion for stories. Her mother, Patricia, taught elementary school and was the kind of teacher that kids remembered for the rest of their lives, not because she was easy, but because she truly, genuinely cared about them as human beings. But more than anything, they loved each other in a way that Sarah had absorbed as the definition of true love. She'd watch them dance in the kitchen while making breakfast, her mother laughing like a teenager while her father spun her around. She'd watch them hold hands during movies, their fingers intertwined with such natural ease that it seemed like an extension of their bodies. She'd watch them disagree, sometimes passionately, sometimes heatedly, about politics, about books, about how to raise Sarah. But always, always, they did it with respect. She'd watched her father say to her mother, "I disagree with you, but I love you and your perspective matters to me." She'd watched her mother listen to her father's opinion and genuinely consider it, not to change her mind necessarily, but to understand him better. That was love, real love, the kind that made you bigger, not smaller, the kind that made you feel seen, not controlled. They'd encouraged Sarah to dream. They'd taken her to museums and libraries. They'd listened to her ideas without judgment. They'd told her that the world was hers to conquer, that she could be anything, that her voice mattered. And for a while, she'd believed them. She'd gotten into Columbia. She'd moved to New York at 18 with 3 suitcases and a heart full of determination. She'd worked harder than anyone else in her marketing program, had gotten the best internships, had climbed the corporate ladder with a single-minded focus that bordered on obsessiveness. By 28, she'd made it, 6 figures, corner office, view of Central Park, everything a successful woman was supposed to want. She'd also become someone her younger self wouldn't recognize. When exactly did it happen? When had she stopped being Sarah Mitchell and become Chris Madison's fiancé? Was it gradual? 1,000 small cuts that added up to a gaping wound. It had started so subtly that she'd almost missed it. A comment here about her friends not being serious enough. A suggestion there about her dress being too casual for his colleagues. A question about where she'd been, who she'd been with, what she'd been doing. At first, she'd rationalized it. He cares about you. He's protective. He just wants the best for you. But then it became more. He'd started checking her phone, reading her texts, suggesting that her job, the job she'd worked so hard to get, wasn't important enough, and that maybe she should prioritize his career instead. Making comments about her body, her appearance, her personality, all framed as wanting her to be the best version of herself. And she'd let it happen. She'd accepted it. She'd thought this was what love was supposed to look like. Until she'd stood at this window, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger, and realized that she was suffocating. The phone call came on a Friday afternoon in March, and it changed everything. Sarah was at her desk, staring at her computer screen without actually seeing it when her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Hey, stranger." The voice on the other end was warm and familiar and made her heart skip a beat in a way she didn't want to analyze too closely. "I know it's been a while, but I'm in the city this weekend. I was hoping you'd want to grab drinks, just like old times." Marcus Williams, her best friend from high school, the person who knew all her secrets, who'd seen her at her worst, and who loved her anyway. "Marcus," she said his name like a prayer, like a lifeline. "That's me. I was hoping you'd remember." Sarah felt guilt wash over her. She hadn't seen Marcus in over a year. A year. How was that possible? How had she let that happen? "I'd love to," she heard herself saying, even as her brain screamed that Chris wouldn't like it. "I'd love to see you." Friday night, Murphy's Bar, 8 o'clock. Friday night, she confirmed. After she hung up, Sarah sat at her desk, her heart racing. She just made a decision that she knew would have consequences. Chris didn't like Marcus. Chris thought Marcus was holding her back and representing her past and not serious enough. Which was a roundabout way of saying that Chris could see that Marcus loved her, and he didn't like it. But Sarah was tired, so tired of managing Chris's emotions, so tired of living a life designed to make him happy, so tired of being small. She looked at the photo on her desk, her parents at her college graduation, both of them beaming with pride. She thought about the girl in that photo, the girl who thought she could do anything, the girl who had dreams and opinions and a voice. What would that girl think of who she'd become? The morning of Friday, March 15th, Sarah woke up next to Chris, and she already knew the day would be difficult. He was reviewing something on his phone, his expression sharp and focused. Everything about Chris was sharp and focused. Nothing was soft about him. Nothing was gentle. "Good morning," she said softly, testing the waters. He didn't respond immediately. She waited, her stomach tightening. Silence meant something was wrong. "I got a call from your office yesterday," he finally said, still not looking at her. "I was trying to reach you, so I called the main line. They said you left at 4:30. Sarah's mouth went dry. She'd forgotten that he sometimes called her office. "I stopped for coffee," she said, but the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "For 3 hours. I went for a walk. I needed to clear my head." Chris turned to face her fully, and she could see the anger simmering beneath the surface. It was the look she'd learned to dread. "Where were you really, Sarah?" She made a choice at that moment. A small choice, maybe, but it would turn out to be the most important choice of her life. "I was meeting Marcus," she said. "He called and wanted to meet up." Chris's face darkened. "Marcus, your old friend Marcus?" "Yes, he's in the city and he wanted to see me." "And you told him yes without consulting me?" "I didn't think I needed to consult you about seeing my best friend." The words hung in the air between them. It was the first time she directly challenged him in months. She could see the shock on his face, followed immediately by anger. "I don't want you seeing him," Chris said flatly. "What, Chris? He's my best friend." "He's in love with you. Anyone with eyes can see it, and you're too naive to understand what that means. I don't want you spending time with him. It's disrespectful to me and to our relationship." Sarah felt something harden in her chest. "That's not fair." "It's not fair," Chris said coldly. "It's about respect, and clearly you don't respect me or you wouldn't have snuck around meeting with another man." He grabbed his suit jacket and headed for the door. "Wait," Sarah called out. "What about tonight? We were supposed to have dinner." "Cancel it," Chris said without turning around. "I'm staying at the office late, and don't bother waiting up." After he left, Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, her hands shaking. She could call Marcus and cancel. She could tell him that Chris didn't want her seeing him, and she would accept that her best friend would slowly fade out of her life like everyone else Chris had deemed unsuitable. She could go back to the life she'd been living. She could accept the cage and stop fighting it. Or she could go. For the first time in years, Sarah realized she was at a genuine crossroads. Every moment before this one had been choices made by default, by doing what was expected, by following the path that looked right from the outside. This was the first time she was choosing for herself. She picked up her phone and texted Marcus, "Still on for tonight. Can't wait to see you." Then she sat in the silence of the penthouse apartment and waited, her heart pounding, for the consequences of her choice. Murphy's Bar was exactly the kind of place Sarah hadn't been to in years. It was casual and unpretentious, with dim lighting and wooden booths worn soft by decades of use. The walls were covered with photographs, black and white pictures of the city from decades past, of regular customers, of moments that mattered to the people who'd passed through these doors. It was the exact opposite of the upscale lounges Chris preferred, with their minimalist decor and craft cocktails that cost $20 and came in glasses the size of thimbles. Sarah loved it immediately. Marcus was already there, sitting in a corner booth with 2 beers waiting. When he saw her, his entire face lit up in a smile so genuine that Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. It was the smile of someone who truly, genuinely loved her. Not the smile of someone who loved what she represented or what he could get from her, but the smile of someone who loved her for exactly who she was. "Sarah Mitchell," he said, standing to pull her into a hug, "you actually came." "I actually came," she confirmed, settling into the booth across from him. "I missed you." "I missed you too." Marcus studied her face with an intensity that made her look away. "You look tired." "I am tired." "No, I mean, you look sad. You look like you're carrying something heavy." Sarah picked up the beer and took a long drink instead of answering. Because how could she explain that she was living a life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt increasingly hollow from the within? How could she put into words the slow suffocation of being controlled by someone who said it was love? They talked for the first hour the way old friends do when they haven't seen each other in a long time. Marcus told her about his work with at-risk youth in the Bronx, about the kids who turned their lives around because someone believed in them, about the genuine satisfaction of knowing he was making a difference. Sarah noticed he glowed when he talked about his work, not with ego or pride, but with genuine fulfillment. She found herself telling him about her job, though she realized she left out most of the details about her life with Chris. She didn't mention the controlling behavior, the isolation, the slow erosion of her sense of self. She just said things like work has been busy and Chris has been stressed. As they talked, Sarah felt something shifting inside her. With Marcus, she didn't have to perform. She didn't have to worry about saying the wrong thing or looking the wrong way. She could just be herself. And that version of herself, the unfiltered, uncontrolled version, remembered who she used to be. Around 10 o'clock, the bar began to fill up. The DJ took over from the Bluetooth speaker, and the music grew louder. A group of people crowded around them, ordering drinks, laughing loudly, celebrating a friend's birthday. Sarah and Marcus moved closer together so they could hear each other over the noise. "I've been worried about you," Marcus said quietly. "Ever since you got engaged, you seem different." "Different how?" "Smaller, like you're taking up less space in the world, like you're trying to make yourself invisible." Sarah didn't respond immediately, because he was right. She had made herself smaller. She'd shrunk herself down to fit into the space Chris had allocated for her, and the worst part was that she'd convinced herself it was the right thing to do. "Chris is very particular about things," she said carefully. "He has high standards." "Is he good to you?" The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Because the truth was nuanced and messy and difficult to explain to someone who hadn't lived it. "He cares about me," Sarah said carefully. "He wants me to be happy." "But are you?" The question hung in the air between them. Sarah looked at Marcus's face, at the genuine concern in his eyes, at the love that had always been there, that she'd maybe always known about but never allowed herself to acknowledge. "I don't know anymore," she admitted. "I used to know. I used to know exactly who I was and what I wanted, but somewhere along the way I lost track." Marcus reached across the table and gently touched her hand. His touch was so gentle, so respectful, asking permission rather than demanding access. "Sarah," he started. But the music changed. The opening notes of "Falling Slowly" filled the bar, and Sarah felt her breath catch. It was their song, the one they danced to at every important moment in their lives, the one that had become theirs without them ever discussing it. "Come dance with me," Marcus said, standing and holding out his hand. Sarah knew she shouldn't. She knew this was crossing a line, crossing into territory that Chris had made very clear was forbidden. She knew that if he found out, there would be consequences. There would be anger, accusations, manipulation, guilt. But as she looked at Marcus's hand, at his hopeful face, at the person who had always been there for her, and asked for nothing in return except to be allowed to love her, she realized something fundamental. She was tired of not crossing lines. She was tired of living the life Chris wanted her to live. She was tired of being small. She was tired of disappearing. She was tired of pretending that control was the same as love. She took his hand. They moved to the dance floor, and the rest of the world seemed to fade away. There was just Marcus and the music and the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. His hand was warm on her back. Her cheek rested against his chest. She could feel his heart beating, steady and strong, a reminder that he was real, that this was real, that she wasn't imagining this moment. As they swayed together, Marcus leaned down close to her ear. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Something I've been wanting to tell you for a long time." Sarah's heart was beating so hard she thought it might come out of her chest. In that moment, suspended in time, dancing to their song, she understood. She'd always understood, really. Somewhere deep down in the part of her that was still honest with herself, she'd known that Marcus loved her. Not as a friend. I really loved her. The way she was beginning to realize she loved him. "What?" she whispered. "Sarah." The first gunshot shattered the moment like glass. In the first second after the gunshot, nobody reacted. The music was loud, and the sound was muffled by distance and the general noise of the bar. Several people looked around, confused, as if not sure what they'd heard. Someone laughed nervously. Then came the second shot. This one was louder, clearer, and this time people knew. Sarah felt the moment the world changed. It was like a switch flipping in her brain. 1 second she was dancing with the person she loved, feeling his heartbeat against her cheek, living in a moment of perfect clarity and honesty. The next second she understood with absolute certainty that death had arrived. The screaming started immediately. It wasn't the screaming of fear exactly, but the screaming of humans confronted with the primal knowledge that their lives might end. It was the sound of everyone's worst nightmare becoming real. Chaos erupted in slow motion and fast forward simultaneously. Bodies began to move in every direction, some toward the exits, pushing and shoving, desperate to escape, some diving under tables, covering their heads with their hands as if that would somehow protect them from bullets. Some just stood frozen, their brains unable to process what was happening. Sarah saw a woman drop her drink, the glass shattering on the floor, the liquid spreading like blood. She saw a man tackle his girlfriend to the ground, covering her body with his own. She saw the bartender grab the phone with shaking hands, trying to call for help, his voice high and panicked. Marcus grabbed Sarah and pulled her down, shielding her body with his own. They fell to the ground between the dance floor and the bar, and Marcus twisted his body so that he was on top of her, one arm across her back, the other covering her head. "Stay down," he whispered urgently. "Don't move, don't make a sound." Sarah's heart was beating so fast she thought it might burst out of her chest. She could feel every inch of Marcus's body against hers, the weight of him, the heat of him, the strength of him protecting her. She could feel his heart racing against her back, could hear his breathing becoming sharp and shallow. More shots, she lost count. Her mind fractured into 1,000 pieces, each one focused on a different sensation. The cold of the floor beneath her face, so cold it almost burned. The smell of gunpowder mixing with alcohol and perfume, acrid and metallic. The sound of the music, still playing incongruously from the speaker, falling slowly, continues to play over the sounds of terror and death. The screams that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, mixing with the terrible sound of the shots. Someone fell on top of them. Marcus adjusted his position to shield her from the additional weight, and Sarah realized with terrible clarity that he was willing to die for her, that he would take bullets for her without hesitation, that he loved her so much that his life was less important than hers. And then she understood what he'd been about to say on the dance floor, before the world exploded. He loved her, really, truly, completely loved her. And in that moment, lying on the floor of a bar while a man with a gun methodically ended lives, Sarah finally understood what real love was supposed to feel like. Not the cage of Chris's control, where love was conditional and dependent on her performing correctly. But this, Marcus's willingness to sacrifice everything, not possession, but protection born from genuine care for her safety and well-being. Not manipulation, but unconditional devotion. If this was the last moment of her life, at least she was spending it with the one person who had ever truly loved her. The shots continued. Sarah tried to count them, but she lost track. 5, 7, 10. More. Each one made her flinch, made her grip Marcus tighter, made her understand how precarious existence actually was, how quickly everything could be taken away, how fragile and precious every moment was. And then, abruptly, there was a new sound. A voice, authoritative and commanding, shouting something she couldn't make out. Then more voices, professional voices. The sound of people trained for this moment arriving to save whoever could still be saved. The gunshots stopped. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the noise had been. It was the silence of a world fundamentally changed. It was the silence of tragedy. It was the silence of before and after. Marcus lifted his head slightly. "I think it's over," he whispered. "I think." He stopped mid-sentence. Sarah felt his body go rigid. Then she felt something warm, too warm, spreading across her back. She felt his breathing change, becoming sharp and pained. "Marcus," she tried to turn around, but he was still pressing her down, still protecting her even as his body was being destroyed. "Don't move," he said, and his voice had changed. It was weaker now, strained with pain. "Just stay still." But Sarah couldn't stay still. She managed to roll him slightly, just enough to see the blood spreading across his shirt. There was so much blood, so much. It was impossible that a human body could contain that much blood. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." "Sarah," Marcus's hand found her face and his touch was shaking. "Look at me, look at my face." She did. His eyes were still the same warm brown they'd always been, but they were starting to lose focus. She could see the light in them beginning to dim, like a candle being slowly extinguished. "I love you," he said clearly, his voice strong despite the pain. As if that was the most important thing she needed to know. As if all the other words in the world were irrelevant compared to those three. "I want you to know that. I love you. I have always loved you." "Marcus, please." But then the police were there, shouting, moving bodies, pulling them apart. Paramedics rushing toward them with equipment and urgency, and the focused intensity of people trained to save lives. Sarah screamed. She screamed for Marcus. She screamed for the people who had died. She screamed for the life that had been going on 5 minutes ago, when the biggest tragedy she could imagine was being trapped in a relationship she didn't want. She screamed for the world that had just ended. St. Luke's Hospital became Sarah's entire world. The waiting room on the 3rd floor where families of the critically injured waited for updates. The coffee was always cold, always terrible, always served in styrofoam cups that made her think about environmental destruction and climate change, and how meaningless those concerns were when the person you loved was fighting for his life. The plastic chairs that never got comfortable no matter how long you sat in them, chairs that seemed designed to prevent sleep, to keep you in a constant state of exhausted vigilance. The television in the corner that played news coverage of the shooting on repeat. She couldn't stop watching it. It felt like a betrayal if she looked away, like she was somehow dishonoring the memory of the people who had died by engaging in other thoughts. The same images over and over. Police cars with flashing lights cutting through the darkness, paramedics rushing with gurneys, the shell of Murphy's bar with its windows shattered, its interior destroyed, transformed from a place of joy into a place of horror. The faces of the 8 people who had died, their names, their ages, their smiling faces from better times, flashed across the screen in an endless loop. Sarah felt like she was drowning while watching everyone else drown. The guilt was suffocating. The knowledge that 8 people were dead and Marcus was fighting for his life because he'd been protecting her. Her parents arrived from Ohio within 6 hours of the shooting. Her mother, Patricia, immediately took charge, speaking to nurses and doctors with the authoritative voice of someone who was used to being listened to. She was trying to understand the severity of Marcus's injuries, trying to make sense of medical terminology, trying to do something, anything, to fix this. Her father, Robert, sat silently beside Sarah and held her hand for hours without speaking. He would just sit there, his weathered hand warm on hers, not trying to comfort her with words. What words could possibly help in a situation like this? Just being present, just being there. And somehow that was exactly what she needed. By the morning after the shooting, Sarah had learned the extent of the damage. Marcus had been shot 14 times. 14. She tried to visualize that. 14 separate moments of impact. 14 separate bullets entered his body. 14 separate wounds. 14 reasons he should have died but didn't. The shooter, a 28-year-old man named David Chen with a documented history of mental illness and a recent eviction notice, had aimed specifically at Marcus. Or maybe just at whoever was nearby. The police were still investigating his motives, but it didn't matter much to Sarah. The result was the same either way. Her best friend's body was riddled with bullets, and she was the reason he'd been there. No, more than that. She was the reason he'd been shot. Every single bullet that went into his body was because he loved her and he was willing to die for her. And that knowledge was slowly destroying her from the inside out. The surgeons removed 7 of the bullets. The remaining 7 were deemed too close to vital organs or the spine to safely remove without risking permanent paralysis or death. They'd have to stay there, part of him, embedded in his flesh, eternal reminders of the night his world ended. "Will he walk?" Sarah asked the surgeon, Dr. Patricia Chen, during one of the updates. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, hollow, distant, like someone else was speaking through her body. "We won't know for a few days," Dr. Chen said carefully. She was kind, Sarah could tell, but she was also trained not to make promises she couldn't keep. The spinal cord wasn't severed, which is positive, but there's swelling and there's always the risk of nerve damage. We're cautiously optimistic, but I don't want to make promises I can't keep. Cautiously optimistic. The phrase bounced around Sarah's mind. Optimistic about what? That her best friend might be able to walk again. That he might not spend the rest of his life paralyzed, unable to feel his own legs, unable to do the work he loved, unable to be the person he'd always been. She felt her mother's hand on her shoulder and realized she was crying. She hadn't even noticed. On the morning of the second day, as Sarah sat in the waiting room with her parents, staring at the cold coffee she couldn't drink and the television she couldn't stop watching, a man in an expensive suit appeared. It was Chris. He was impeccably dressed, as always, his tie perfectly knotted, his shoes polished to a mirror shine. But there was something off about him. His eyes looked red, and his jaw was clenched tight in a way that made Sarah's entire body tense. "Sarah," he said, moving toward her with a kind of urgency. "Thank God, I came as soon as I heard." Sarah stood, uncertain. She'd checked her phone obsessively over the past 18 hours, waiting for him to reach out, waiting for him to show that he cared about what had happened to her. He hadn't called. He hadn't texted. He hadn't shown up until now, until it was almost too late to pretend he cared. Chris pulled her into an embrace and she let him, though her arms didn't quite come around him. She was too tired, too broken, too aware of the fact that the person holding her wasn't the person she needed. "This is my fault," Chris said, stepping back to look at her. "I shouldn't have let you go out that night. I should have insisted you stay home." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. They were standing in a hospital. The man she loved, the real person she loved, was upstairs fighting for his life. And Chris was making this about himself. "This isn't your fault," Sarah said, her voice flat and hollow. "This isn't anyone's fault except the person who shot Marcus. But if you hadn't been there, if you hadn't been so insistent on going out against my wishes—" "Stop," Sarah said. She felt something hardening inside her, something cold and clear cutting through the fog of grief and trauma. "Just stop." Her mother, Patricia, who had been listening quietly from her chair, stood up. "You must be Chris," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Patricia Mitchell, Sarah's mother." Chris took her hand automatically, shaking it with the confident grip of someone used to making good first impressions. "Of course," Chris said. "It's nice to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "I'd like to talk to you privately," Patricia said, gesturing toward the hallway. Sarah watched as her mother led Chris away. She couldn't hear what they were saying, but she could see the expressions on their faces. Chris's expression grew darker and darker, his jaw clenched tighter, his hands formed fists at his sides. Her mother's expression remained calm, but there was steel in it. The kind of steel that Patricia had learned from 20 years of teaching children, from setting boundaries, from refusing to be disrespected or to allow others to be disrespected in her presence. Whatever Patricia said to Chris, it was effective. When they returned, Chris looked like he'd been hit by a truck. "I need to get back to the office," he said to Sarah, his voice tight, "but I'll be back to check on you." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that felt empty and performative, and left the hospital. He didn't return that day, or the next day, or any day after that. And Sarah was grateful. She was grateful that her mother had said whatever she'd said. She was grateful that Chris had chosen to disappear, because she couldn't have handled his presence, his blame, his self-centeredness, his need to be the victim in someone else's tragedy. She had no more energy to give him. All of her energy, all of her focus, all of her capacity for emotion was being funneled toward the man upstairs who was fighting for his life. On the third day, Marcus woke up. He was heavily sedated, connected to more tubes and machines than Sarah could count. Breathing tube down his throat, IV lines in both arms, the heart monitor beeps steadily, a catheter, bandages covering most of his body. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "Marcus," Sarah said, immediately moving to his bedside and taking his unbandaged hand carefully. "Can you hear me? It's Sarah, I'm here." She wasn't sure if he could understand her, if the drugs were letting him process what she was saying, but she needed him to hear her. She needed him to know he wasn't alone. His eyes moved slightly, tracking her voice, though it wasn't clear if he was actually seeing her or just responding to sound. "You're at St. Luke's Hospital," Sarah continued, speaking slowly and clearly like she was talking to a small child. "You were shot, but you're alive. You're going to be okay." She didn't know if that last part was true, but she said it anyway because it was the only thing she knew how to say. Over the next several hours, as the sedation wore off, Marcus became increasingly aware. The confusion faded, replaced by a dawning understanding of where he was and what had happened. He couldn't speak because of the breathing tube, but he could blink, and he could move his fingers, and he could look at Sarah with recognition in his eyes. The doctors performed tests. They asked him to move his toes. His right toes responded immediately, wiggling at the command. His left toes didn't. Not at first. Sarah watched as a shadow of fear crossed Marcus's face. She could see him understand in that moment the magnitude of what had happened to him. She could see him realize that he might be paralyzed. But then slowly over the next few hours, as the swelling began to decrease, and as his body began the initial stages of recovery, the left toes began to move as well. It was a small thing, such a small thing, but it meant everything. It meant the spinal cord, while damaged, wasn't completely severed. It meant that there was hope. They removed the breathing tube on the fourth day, and Marcus's first words were hoarse and barely audible. "Sarah," he said, "are you okay?" Even in the hospital, Even after being shot 14 times, his first concern was her. She felt something in her heart crack open. "I'm okay," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm fine, you saved my life." Marcus closed his eyes. 14 times, he said softly. "He shot me 14 times." "But you're alive," Sarah said. "You're going to recover." Marcus didn't respond, but Sarah could see the motion beneath his eyelids, the telltale sign of tears leaking down the sides of his face. A week after the shooting, Sarah sat beside Marcus's hospital bed while he rested. His mother, Angela, who had arrived from their hometown 2 days after the shooting, was in the hospital cafeteria getting coffee. Sarah had been spending nearly every moment at the hospital. She'd called her work and told them she was taking a leave of absence. She couldn't even imagine going back to that office, to that life that suddenly felt so small and meaningless compared to the gravity of what was happening here. She'd stopped responding to Chris's text messages, the ones that started out concerned and gradually became angry and accusatory, blaming her for putting herself in danger, blaming Marcus for not protecting her well enough, blaming everyone but himself for the fact that she wasn't responding with the appropriate amount of gratitude and guilt and dependence. But Marcus wasn't blaming anyone. Marcus was just trying to survive, and that required every ounce of his strength and focus. His eyes opened as Sarah watched him sleep. Even unconscious, his face showed the strain of what his body had been through. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. His face had lost weight, almost gaunt now, hollowed out by pain and trauma and the massive physical trauma his body had endured. His skin had the pale, almost translucent quality of someone who'd been through something his body was still trying to process, still trying to recover from. "You're here," he said. His voice was still hoarse from the breathing tube, but it was getting stronger every day. "I'm always here," Sarah said. "You should go home, you should rest. You're going to make yourself sick." "I'm fine," Sarah said firmly. "I'm not leaving." Marcus didn't argue. He'd learned by now that there was no point in trying to convince Sarah to leave. She would sit beside him. She would hold his hand. She would be present through all of it. And he needed her to be present, more than he needed anything else in the world. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Sarah could see the wheels turning in his mind, could tell he was working up to something important. She could see him gathering courage, the way someone gathers courage to jump off a cliff into unknown waters. "I need to tell you something," he finally said. "Before the shooting, I was going to tell you something." Sarah's heart rate increased. She knew what he was going to say. She'd known since that moment on the dance floor, maybe even before. There had always been something between them, something unspoken, something that had colored every interaction, every text message, every phone call, every moment they'd spent together. "You don't have to," she started, but Marcus interrupted. "I do," he said. His voice was weak, but there was steel underneath it, the kind of steel that comes from knowing you're running out of time, knowing that you might not get another chance. "Because I almost didn't get the chance. And if I had died in that hospital, if I had bled out before the paramedics got to me, if those surgeries had gone wrong, you never would have known." He paused, gathering strength from somewhere deep within himself. "I love you, Sarah. Not as a friend, I love you romantically. I have for years. I know you're engaged. I know this is terrible timing. I know this might ruin our friendship. But I need you to know. I couldn't not tell you. It would have felt like a betrayal of everything I feel for you." Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks. Her vision blurred. Her throat tightened so much she could barely breathe. "I know," she said. "You know. I've always known, I think, on some level, and—" she took a breath, gathering her own courage. "And I love you too, not just as a friend. I don't know if that's the kind of love you're talking about, romantic love, forever love, the kind of love that lasts, but it's real and it's deep, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending it doesn't exist." Marcus stared at her, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing, as if this was too much to hope for, too good to be true. "What about Chris?" he asked. "I ended the engagement," Sarah said. "2 days ago. I called him and told him it was over. I'm moving out of the penthouse next week. I already hired movers. I already found an apartment." "Sarah, you can't make decisions like that because of what happened. You're in shock. You're emotional. You're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," Sarah said firmly. She leaned forward, careful not to jostle any of his medical equipment, careful to protect his healing body as if it were precious, because it was. "I was in shock before, shock that I'd let myself become someone I don't recognize. Shock that I'd accepted a life where I was smaller, quieter, less myself every single day. But the shooting, it woke me up." She paused, searching for the right words. "It made me realize that we're not promised tomorrow. We could die today, any of us, at any moment. So what's the point of spending the time we have on people who don't let us be ourselves? What's the point of building a life with someone who makes you less instead of more?" She took his hand more firmly in hers, holding it like she never wanted to let go. "I love you," she said again. "I don't know if it's the kind of love that lasts forever. I don't know if we work together romantically. I don't know what the future holds. But I know that I want to find out, if you want that too." Marcus's hand, the one that could move, reached up and touched her face. His fingers were gentle, as if he was afraid she might disappear if he held too tightly. "I want that," he whispered. "I want you. I want us. I want all of it. Even the uncertainty, even the fear. Even if it falls apart, I'd rather have you for one day than spend my whole life wishing I'd told you the truth." Marcus spent 6 weeks in the hospital. The first 3 weeks were the hardest. He underwent 2 more surgeries to remove some of the remaining bullets and repair the damage they'd caused. He dealt with infections that spiked his temperature and made him delirious with fever. He had nightmares where he relived the moment the bullets hit him, where he could feel them penetrating his flesh over and over again. He grieved. He grieved for the body he'd lost, not just the physical damage from the bullets, but the ease of movement that he'd taken for granted his entire life. He grieved for the person he'd been before March 15th, the person who could run and jump and dance without thinking about it, without calculating angles and pain levels and what his body could and couldn't do anymore. That person felt like someone else entirely, a ghost, a memory, a version of himself that no longer existed. Sarah was there for all of it. She brought him books and read to him when he couldn't focus well enough to read himself, when the pain medications made it impossible to concentrate on anything but the sensations in his body. She sat with him during his physical therapy sessions, watching him struggle to move muscles that felt like they weren't connected to his brain anymore, encouraging him through moments when the pain was so intense that he would just shut down emotionally, disappearing into himself. She held his hand during the dark moments when he wondered if recovery was even worth fighting for. She stayed silent when he needed silence, and she spoke when he needed to hear her voice, assuring him that he would get through this, that his body would heal, that life was still worth living even if it was different than what he'd expected. The doctors were cautiously optimistic about his recovery. The nerve damage was significant, but it wasn't permanent. With intense physical therapy, he would likely regain most of his mobility. He would probably always have chronic pain, the kind of pain that would be a permanent reminder of that night. He would definitely never be exactly the same as he was before. But he would walk, eventually. By the end of the 4th week, Marcus was able to sit up in bed without assistance, a small victory that felt monumental. By the end of the 5th week, he was able to stand, with significant support from physical therapists and a walker, his legs shaking from the effort, sweat beading on his forehead, but standing nonetheless. By the end of the 6th week, he was discharged from the hospital with a prescription for ongoing physical therapy, a list of pain medications, a walker, and hope that his life could be rebuilt. Sarah had rented a small, one-bedroom apartment in the Bronx, not far from where Marcus's apartment was located. She'd spent the last week moving his things from his old place and setting up the apartment to accommodate his recovery. She'd moved furniture so he would have clear paths to navigate without tripping. She'd installed grab bars in the bathroom and along the hallway. She'd made the bed with the softest sheets she could find. She'd stocked the refrigerator with healthy food that would support his healing. She'd prepared everything, trying to make the transition home as smooth as possible. When the hospital discharge nurse wheeled Marcus to the car, Sarah saw him looking at the world with new eyes, the way someone looks at something they thought they might never see again, the way someone looks at a gift they never expected to receive. "Welcome home," Sarah said softly, helping him into the passenger seat. Her hand was steady, but her voice shook slightly. During the drive to the apartment, Marcus was quiet. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked. "I'm just thinking about how close I came to not having this," he said. "Not having days like this. Not having you. Not having the chance to try again, to do things differently, to live a real life." "You're always going to have me," Sarah said. "Whether we work out romantically or not, I'm not going anywhere." Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand. "I know," he said. "That's why I love you." The next 3 months were defined by physical therapy and emotional recovery. Marcus attended sessions 3 times a week, working with a therapist named Jerome who was patient but relentless in pushing him to move beyond the pain and the trauma. "Your body wants to heal," Jerome told him during one session, "but your mind has to give it permission. As long as you believe you're broken, your body will believe it too." But Marcus did feel broken. He felt it in the phantom pain that would strike without warning, making him think he was being shot all over again. He felt it in the nightmares that would jolt him awake at 3 a.m., his heart racing, his body covered in sweat, the sheets tangled around him like restraints. He felt it in the moments when he would look down at his scarred body and barely recognize it as his own. His chest was a road map of scars. His side was damaged in ways that would never fully heal. His left leg had nerve damage that made it feel like pins and needles constantly, a physical reminder of what had happened. He grieved. He grieved for the body he'd lost, for the ease of movement that he'd taken for granted, for the person he'd been before March 15th. That person felt like someone else entirely, someone carefree, someone who could dance without thinking about it, someone who could help the kids in his program by running alongside them, coaching them through physical challenges. That person was gone. But Sarah wouldn't let him give up. She watched as Marcus slowly, painstakingly, relearned how to walk. She was there for every session, holding his hand during physical therapy, encouraging him through moments when the pain was so intense that tears streamed down his face and he wanted to quit. "You can do this," she would say, and he would believe her. The first time he walked across the apartment without assistance, Sarah cried. She cried tears of joy and relief and gratitude that he was alive, that he was walking, that they had been given this second chance. She held him and cried against his shoulder, and he held her back, understanding without words what those tears meant. The first time he walked down the street without a cane, he cried. His legs shaking, his body still weak, pain shooting through his side with every step, but his spirit became stronger for having proven to himself that he could do it. The first time they walked all the way to the park and sat on a bench watching the sunset, they both cried. Because it was such a small thing, just a walk to a park, but it meant everything. It meant recovery. It meant hope. It meant that life could be rebuilt from tragedy. But there were also difficult moments. There were nights when the nightmares were so bad that Sarah had to hold him down to keep him from thrashing and ripping out his physical therapy gains. There were moments when the pain was so intense that he couldn't help but lash out at her, snapping at her over small things, blaming her for things that weren't her fault. He would always apologize afterward, devastated by his own cruelty. "I'm sorry," he would say, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, you don't deserve this. You should leave me. I'm not going anywhere, Sarah would say firmly. I know you're scared, I know you're in pain, and I'm still here. There were also moments when Marcus had to face the reality of what had happened to him. The trauma of nearly dying, the guilt of surviving when 8 other people didn't, the complex mix of emotions that came with being alive when others weren't so lucky. Sarah started seeing a therapist too, a woman named Dr. Lisa Torres who specialized in trauma and PTSD. You're carrying a lot of guilt, Dr. Torres said during one session, like you feel responsible for what happened. I feel like I should have died instead of him being shot, Sarah admitted. The shooter targeted me. If Marcus hadn't been protecting me, then the shooter probably would have shot Marcus anyway, Dr. Torres interrupted gently. Or you, or someone else. You can't control what a random act of violence does. You can only control how you respond to it. Sarah was quiet, absorbing the words. I feel like I owe him my life, she finally said. Like I can never repay what he did for me. What if you separated those two feelings? Dr. Torres suggested. What if you could love him without the debt? What if you could let yourself choose him, not because he saved you, but because he makes you happy? Not out of obligation, but out of genuine love. It took Sarah several months to untangle those feelings, to understand the difference between gratitude and love, between obligation and choice, between owing someone your life and choosing to spend your life with them. But gradually, she began to understand. She learned that loved Marcus because he was kind, because he made her laugh even during dark moments, because he saw her fully and accepted all of her without trying to change her or control her. She would have loved him even if the shooting had never happened. The shooting didn't create their love, it just revealed it. The wedding planning took 4 months. It was a small ceremony, just immediate family and a few close friends. No need for the elaborate, expensive affair that she'd planned with Chris. This would be simple and meaningful and true. It would be held in the community center where Marcus worked, decorated simply with flowers and candles. The reception would be catered by Sarah's favorite restaurant, the one with the authentic Italian food and the owner who remembered everyone's name. Everything was intentional, everything meant something. Sarah's mother helped her design the dress. Her mother's wedding dress, actually, altered slightly to fit Sarah's frame. There was poetry in that, in wearing the dress of a woman who had taught her what real love looked like. Patricia had worn that dress when she married Robert, and they were still together, still in love, still choosing each other every single day. Sarah wanted to honor that legacy. Marcus couldn't kneel for the proposal, and he wouldn't be able to kneel at the altar, but Sarah didn't care. His body had been broken, yes, but his spirit was intact. His heart was whole. His love was real. That was what mattered. The night before the wedding, Sarah found Marcus sitting in their apartment, looking out at the city, looking at the ring on his own finger. Second thoughts, she asked, settling beside him. Not about marrying you, he said immediately. But I keep thinking about how close we came to this not happening. How if he'd aimed differently, if the angle had been just slightly different. But he didn't, Sarah said firmly. We're here, we made it, that has to count for something. It counts for everything, Marcus said. You're everything. The day of the wedding was unseasonably warm for January, as if the universe was blessing their union. Sarah arrived at the community center and made her way to the small room where she would wait before walking down the aisle. Her mother was with her, helping her with her veil, touching up her makeup, being present in all the ways a mother should be. Patricia stood back and looked at her daughter, and tears formed in her eyes. You look beautiful, Patricia said. I'm so proud of you, of how strong you've been, of how you've chosen love even after almost losing everything. I learned it from you, Sarah said, hugging her mother carefully so she wouldn't mess up her dress. In the main room, Marcus stood at the altar with Jerome, his physical therapist and best man. Marcus was nervous. She would find out later, his leg bouncing slightly, but he was also smiling. When Sarah appeared in the doorway, his expression transformed. The nervousness faded, replaced by a kind of wonder, a kind of gratitude, a kind of love that was so pure and so real that people in the audience gasped. They decided to walk down the aisle together rather than having Sarah walk alone. Sarah's father, Robert, walked her partway, and then Marcus met her, taking her hand and walking the rest of the way with her. His limp was still visible, but his grip on her hand was strong. The ceremony was simple but meaningful. They'd written their own vows, and each of them spoke from the heart. "I vow to choose you," Marcus said, his voice steady and strong despite the emotion behind it. "Every day, even when it's hard, even when I'm scared or hurt or angry, I vow to see you fully and love you completely. I vow to build a life with you that means something. I vow to spend the rest of my days making sure you know how much you matter to me." "I vow to be myself," Sarah said, "fully and completely. I vow to not make myself smaller for anyone. I vow to love you not because you saved my life, but because you make my life worth living. I vow to show up every single day and choose us. I vow to build a future with you that we create together on our own terms." When they kissed, there was applause and cheers, but what Sarah heard most was the quiet sound of her own heart, beating steadily, beating strong, beating with purpose. The reception was joy incarnate. Music played, people danced. Stories were told about Marcus and Sarah's journey, about the friendship that had become love, about the tragedy that had become transformation. Sarah's father gave a touching toast about how his daughter had learned to value truth over comfort, love over fear. He talked about how he'd watched her become a ghost of herself while she was with Chris, and how the shooting, as terrible as it was, had somehow freed her to be herself again. Marcus's mother, Angela, spoke about how grateful she was to have Sarah in their lives, how her son had come home broken and been rebuilt not by doctors or machines, but by love. She talked about watching the two of them together and understanding, for the first time, what unconditional love really meant. The food was delicious, the drinks flowed, the dancing lasted late into the evening. And when the final slow song played, Marcus and Sarah held each other on the dance floor, swaying together, no longer dancing to escape something, but dancing to celebrate something. "I love you," Sarah whispered. "I love you," Marcus whispered back. And for the first time since that night at Murphy's bar, life felt full. It felt complete. It felt like home. 1 year later, the small house on Maple Street in a quiet neighborhood of the Bronx had become their sanctuary. It wasn't fancy. The walls needed painting and the hardwood floors creaked in certain spots, but it was theirs and they loved it. Sarah stood in the doorway of the nursery, watching as Marcus carefully placed the crib in the corner, positioning it so he could see it from their bed. He moved more slowly than he had before the shooting. His left side would always have a slight limp, and physical therapy would always be part of his routine, but he moved with purpose and strength. "Do you think she'll like it?" Marcus asked, turning to look at Sarah, who was 7 months pregnant. "She'll love it," Sarah said, resting her hand on her belly where their daughter was growing. "Just like she's going to love you." Marcus crossed the room and put his arms around both Sarah and their unborn child. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For choosing me, for coming back to me, for building this life with me." Sarah turned in his arms so she could look at him directly. "You saved my life at Murphy's bar," she said, "but you've also saved my life every day since, by loving me, by believing in me, by being the person I always knew you were." They stood together in the nursery, in the house they'd built together, in the life they'd chosen, and Sarah thought about how fragile everything was, how quickly it could be taken away, how precious that made every moment. The shooting had taken 8 lives, 14 people. It had traumatized a community. Those were tragic, terrible facts that could never be changed or forgotten. but it had also, in a strange and complicated way, given Sarah her life back. It had forced her to stop running from herself. It had given her permission to break free from a relationship that was suffocating her. It had brought her closer to the person who loved her most. It had taught her that life was too short to waste on anything but love and truth. And that was the real story. Not the tragedy, but what came after. Not the breaking, but the rebuilding. Not the loss, but what was gained in the process of learning to live again. If you made it this far, thank you. Thank you for spending 90 minutes with Sarah and Marcus's story. Thank you for letting their journey touch your heart. And I want to ask you something. What did this story mean to you? Did it remind you of someone you know? Did it make you think about the relationships in your own life? Did it make you realize that you deserve better? That you deserve love that makes you bigger, not smaller? Please comment below. Tell me your thoughts. I read every single comment and I respond to as many as I can. Your words and experience matters. If this video moved you, if it made you feel something, please hit that like button. Every like helps me reach more people who need to hear stories like this one. And if you love emotional stories that make you think and feel deeply, please subscribe to Mindscape Daily Stories. We post new stories every week, stories about real people, real struggles, real love, real redemption. Stories that matter. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Maybe it's a friend who's in a controlling relationship. Maybe it's someone who's grieving. Maybe it's someone who's learning to love themselves again. Share it. Let them know they're not alone. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more.